noches para todas y para todos. Muchísimas gracias por este espacio, por permitirnos compartir con ustedes lo que estamos trabajando en frente al TLC.
Good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for this space. Thank you so much for the ability to share with you the work that we're doing around the Free Trade Agreement.
Lo que estamos haciendo tiene una importancia muy grande para las organizaciones de derechos humanos, para las comunidades afrocolombianas, indígenas, campesinos, para todas las comunidades empobrecidas de Colombia.
The work that we're doing is very important to the human rights organizations, Afro-Colombian organizations, indigenous organizations, and campesino organizations, and all of the poor in Colombia.
Para las diferentes comunidades organizadas que resisten y que intentan construir una realidad donde haya justicia.
For all communities who are resisting, who are working to construct a different reality.
Esas comunidades por muchos años han luchado en contra de lo que se llama libre comercio, que no es más que el empobrecimiento de la gente y el saqueo de las riquezas de nuestro país.
These organizations and people have been working for years to stop the free trade agreement, stop free trade. Because this agreement is nothing but the impoverishment of the people and the robbing of our resources.
Nosotros desde las comunidades seguimos luchando, pero en este momento, frente al Tratado de Libre Comercio, es fundamental el apoyo que ustedes, como pueblo de los Estados Unidos, puedan darnos.
We within the communities have been fighting and continue fighting against the free trade agreement. However, the support from you all, the United States citizens and people, are key in this struggle.
Por más que intentamos evitarlo, el Congreso de mi país y los altos tribunales de mi país ya aprobaron el Tratado de Libre Comercio.
For the much that we struggle to avoid it, the Congress and other entities in my country have already approved the free trade agreement.
Solo falta un paso para que este tratado sea aprobado, y es que en el Congreso de los Estados Unidos se dé la aprobación, se dé la firma de aprobación a ese acuerdo.
There's only one step left before the agreement would be passed, and that is that the U.S. Congress pass the agreement, that they sign it to move forward.
Y por eso es tan importante lo que ustedes puedan hacer, porque presionando a sus congresistas, a sus senadores, es probable que ellos no firmen ese acuerdo.
And that's why you are so important in this agreement, because if you pressure the House of Representatives and the Senate, it is possible that they decide not to pass this free trade agreement.
¿Y por qué queremos que no se firme? Porque ese acuerdo, con el falso discurso de que es un libre comercio, pretende imponer a las comunidades de mi país unas situaciones de vida más adversas de las que actualmente vivimos.
And why do we think it's possible to not pass this agreement? And that's because this agreement, this misnamed free trade agreement, has been promoted through a false discourse, through lies, basically. And what it would really do is impose upon our country impoverishment.
Primero nos han dicho que es un tratado. Nosotros decimos que no es un tratado, sino una imposición, porque a las comunidades afrocolombianas, indígenas, campesinas, sindicales, a las organizaciones de mujeres, a las múltiples organizaciones, nunca les escucharon sus opiniones, nunca les preguntaron si les parecía bien eso que las élites de Colombia están acordando con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
We don't call this free trade agreement because it's not a treaty, it's rather, it's been imposed upon us, it's an imposition. And that's because Afro-Colombian communities and indigenous communities, campesinos, unionists and women, all these different organizations of the different communities in Colombia, they were not asked what their opinion was. They were not asked if they wanted the free trade agreement or not. This is a project, it's an agreement that is set out between the elite of my country and the government of the United States.
Si ustedes pudieran preguntarle, por ejemplo, a las comunidades campesinas qué piensan de este tratado, seguramente lo que ellas les van a decir es que de aprobarse este acuerdo económico, ellas como comunidades campesinas van a desaparecer.
if you were able to ask the campesinos, the small-scale farmers in my country, what they think about the free trade agreement, they would say that if this free trade agreement is passed, that their communities, as rural and small farming communities, would disappear.
Porque implementar ese tipo de acuerdos es como colocar a un niño de 10 años a correr con un atleta profesional olímpico.
Because implementing this free trade agreement is something like having a 10-year-old race against an Olympic athlete.
Los campesinos de mi país tienen unas formas ancestrales de cultivar y de proteger la tierra.
Because the campesinos in my country have an ancestral method of cultivating and protecting the Mother Earth.
Y por muchos años ellos y ellas han garantizado que la gente de las ciudades y la gente del campo tengan alimentos suficientes.
And for many years, these small-scale farmers have been able to guarantee that the people in the cities and in the countryside have access to food.
Pero si entran a operar en Colombia grandes corporaciones agroindustriales, estas comunidades campesinas no tienen ni el poder industrial, ni el poder tecnológico, ni el músculo financiero para defenderse de corporaciones agroindustriales tan grandes como las que existen en Estados Unidos.
However, if corporate agribusiness is able to enter into Colombia, the small-scale farmers of Colombia do not have the industrial power, the technology, or the financial muscle to compete against the large agribusiness of the United States.
Y allí quisiéramos como pensar sobre la segunda palabra, que es libre.
And now I'd like for us to think a little bit about the first word of the free trade agreement, and that is free.
Porque las corporaciones y las élites económicas de mi país siempre han planteado que el mercado, funcionando libremente, va a regular las relaciones económicas.
The corporations and the elite of my country have argued that if a market is allowed to act freely and uninhibited, that this free market would be able to regulate the economic conditions of the country.
Sin embargo, es un doble discurso porque es libre en términos de que los trabajadores sindicales pierdan su seguridad en términos laborales, que la comunidad en general pierda la garantía pública de los derechos a la educación, a la salud, a la alimentación, a la vivienda, pero no es libre cuando se trata de que el Estado garantice que las grandes corporaciones tengan sus ganancias.
Free within the free market, yes, is free for the unionists who lose their job security. Yes, it's free for the communities because they lose their right to education, their right to health care, their right to housing. However, we see that this discussion is hypocritical because it's not free for the state, because the state has to guarantee the profits of the corporations.
En el capítulo de inversión de ese acuerdo de libre comercio dice, por ejemplo, que se deben garantizar todas las condiciones jurídicas para que las corporaciones tengan seguridad absoluta sobre las inversiones que van a hacer.
The investment chapter of the Free Trade Agreement says that the Colombian state must guarantee the legal conditions for corporations so that corporations have absolute security for their investments.
Lo que quiere decir, en esas mismas líneas, que el Estado no puede intervenir en las relaciones económicas.
What this wants to say is that the state can't intervene in the economic relations.
Y que sin embargo, si alguna gran corporación llega a perder su inversión, el Estado sí debe responderle no solo por lo que pierde en ese momento, sino por las utilidades que tiene proyectadas por muchos años más.
However, if a corporation loses its investment in the country, the Colombian state should intervene because they should respond for and cover the losses that were lost in the investment, and as well as the lost future profits that the company would have made if they hadn't had that the original loss.
Ahorita hablábamos en la mesa de que es una práctica que no solo se presenta en Colombia, sino en otras partes del mundo, y es que usted puede ir a un banco que tenga muchas utilidades y decirle: este año tuviste tantos millones de utilidades, por favor me entregas tantos millones que yo los necesito.
We were talking earlier at dinner about this, about the practice of how this really happens in the world. And it's not just in Colombia, but it's worldwide. And that is that when banks are actually making a lot of money and are making millions of dollars, and if you go to them and say, hey, you have great profits, how about you share that with a little bit of us?
Y los dueños del banco te van a decir: no, eso es mío.
And the bank's owners will say, no, this is mine.
Pero cuando los bancos y las corporaciones pierden, si vienen a todos nosotros y nos van a decir: ustedes, no voluntariamente, sino obligados, tienen que reponernos todas las pérdidas que hemos tenido.
However, if a bank or a corporation begins to lose money or lose their position, they come to the people and they say, they don't ask for volunteers, but rather the state is obliged to fill in the losses, to cover their losses.
Y aunque nosotros no queramos, les entregan 750.000 millones a las corporaciones.
And so even though we don't want it, we see that $700 billion are turned over to the corporations.
Y pasa en este y en otras partes del mundo.
And this happens here and other parts of the world.
Y el otro elemento es que nos dicen que es comercio, que hay intercambio de productos, pero lo que vemos en realidad es que va a ser mucho mayor el flujo de mercancías de los Estados Unidos hacia Colombia, de tal manera que nosotros vamos a ver afectadas todas las prácticas culturales de alimentos, por ejemplo.
Furthermore, when talking about the free trade agreement, they say that this is about the inter-exchange, the trade of products. However, we see that under a free trade agreement, there would be much stronger flow of products from the United States into Colombia, as opposed to the other way around. And because of this, Colombia would lose a lot of its cultural practices, particularly within the agricultural sector.
Además de que se plantea dentro de las exigencias del Tratado de Libre Comercio que no se coloque ningún tipo de condición a las inversiones que se van a hacer en el territorio colombiano.
Another demand that exists within the free trade agreement is that the state can't put any sort of conditions upon investment that happens within the Colombian territory.
Y no colocar condiciones quiere decir no cobrar aranceles, no exigirle que contraten cierta cantidad de mano de obra nacional, no exigirles que se queden sus capitales por cierto periodo de tiempo.
And when talking about not being able to put conditions on the investment, that means that, for instance, they can't have tariffs on these investments. They can't have requirements for minimum amounts of national work contraction, of hiring national Colombian workers, that they can't put conditions or controls upon the amount of time that capital is invested within Colombia.
No exigirles que hagan transferencia de tecnología a el país, a Colombia.
They can't demand that the corporations do technology transfers to Colombia.
Y Colombia, para competir frente al poder económico, cultural de los Estados Unidos, tiene fundamentalmente solo dos fortalezas. La primera es que hay muchas personas desempleadas, es decir, que hay muchas personas que están dispuestas a trabajar por bajos salarios.
And looking at the competition, Colombia has two strengths when comparing it to the strengths, the economic and cultural strengths that the United States has. The first strength that Colombia has in its favor is that they have a very high level of unemployment, which means there's a lot of people who are willing to work for very low salaries.
Pero en realidad esa no es una ventaja que garantice la inversión, porque no es solo Colombia la que tiene ese tipo de condiciones, y hay muchos países en el mundo que pueden atraer capitales de esa manera.
However, when we look at this closer, we see that this really isn't an advantage for Colombia, because there's actually a lot of countries in the world who have very high unemployment and thus have that type of attraction.
Donde incluso el problema no es solo que lleguen o no lleguen inversiones, porque incluso en el caso positivo de que sí llegaran esas inversiones, eso significa explotación para la gente que trabaja en esos centros de producción, que en su mayoría generalmente son mujeres.
And the question really isn't whether or not Colombia or any country can attract this type of investment to their country. Because in reality, we see that this investment really means the exploitation of the people and work centers, for instance. And so attracting investment means exploitation of the people. And in particular, in these areas, we often see that women are those who are most exploited.
Y en este momento es importante también decir que eso no solo afecta a la gente que vive en Colombia, sino también afecta al pueblo, en este caso de los Estados Unidos.
It's important to point out that this free trade agreement and the situation doesn't just affect the people in Colombia, but it also affects the people of the United States.
Porque las corporaciones se van donde hay gente que esté muy mal pagada y cierran, por ejemplo, centros de producción aquí mismo en los Estados Unidos, generando desempleo para la gente de acá.
Because we see that these corporations are willing to look for work anywhere they can. And so they go looking for people who are willing to be, or who are desperate enough to be really poorly paid. And they end up closing the centers of production here in the United States, creating greater unemployment here.
Y eso no nos lo estamos inventando, eso pasó con el NAFTA. Quebraron 3 millones de campesinos mexicanos y muchos miles de personas en los Estados Unidos se quedaron sin trabajo.
And this isn't just hypothetical, this is what we have already seen with NAFTA. That under NAFTA, 3 million farmers lost their jobs in Mexico, and here in the United States, millions of people also lost their jobs as the factories left.
Y el otro elemento que tiene Colombia para competir frente a la gran capacidad de las corporaciones es las materias primas, los recursos naturales con los que contamos.
And the second element that Colombia has that puts it at an advantage in competition with the United States is that it has a large amount of natural resources, the prime materials for production.
Y ello nos preocupa profundamente porque en el cuerpo del Tratado de Libre Comercio también se plantean, y eso lo hemos venido observando en las reformas políticas de mi país, una flexibilización de las exigencias ambientales.
And we see in the free trade agreement itself something that really worries us, and that is something that we've seen already coming through our national government, and that is changes in our policies that flexibilize or make less stringent the restrictions that protect the environment.
Flexibilización, que significa que hay menos condiciones menos exigencias para que en sus inversiones las corporaciones protejan el medio ambiente y al contrario tengan sí garantías para sacar los recursos que necesiten por encima de la protección a la naturaleza y por encima de las comunidades que habitan en esos territorios.
What does the flexibilization of protections mean? That means there's less conditions and less demands upon the corporations who are making investments. And so the corporations who are investing don't have to protect in the same ways that they should. They don't have to protect the environment. And and the guarantees to the corporations that they're allowed to take out these resources and sell them and get them extracted, these guarantees are much stronger than the guarantees that do exist to protect the environment and the communities where these resources exist.
En este momento, por ejemplo, hay en el mundo un discurso de que se deben de producir combustibles ecológicos, combustibles limpios.
In the world today, there's a discourse that says that we should produce clean fuels, ecological fuels such as biodiesel.
El Tratado de Libre Comercio dice que se va a estimular los sectores innovadores de la economía y la producción de combustibles limpios es uno de ellos.
The Free Trade Agreement says that it's going to stimulate innovative sectors of the economy, and the area of biodiesel, clean fuels, is one of these areas.
Y en este momento eso en Colombia ya se viene haciendo, pero a un precio muy alto. Están tumbando selva virgen para sembrar palma aceitera o para sembrar otros productos en un discurso que uno no entiende, porque destruyen selva, quisque para producir combustible limpio.
And in Colombia, we already see that these biofuels are being encouraged and that this is already in the process of happening. And what this means is that we see that there are virgin forests that are being knocked down to allow for the cultivation of oil palm and other such products. So we see a kind of contradictory discourse where we're saying on one hand that we have to produce clean fuels and on the other hand we are knocking down virgin forests.
No tiene sentido. Para proteger el medio ambiente, destruyo las selvas tropicales.
It makes no sense to protect the environment through destroying our tropical forests.
Y el otro escenario es que, por ejemplo, en las grandes plantaciones de caña de azúcar en Colombia, para producir combustible limpio se les pagan salarios supremamente explotadores a los trabajadores que allí laboran.
And we see another aspect of it in the sugarcane plantations in Colombia, where to produce ethanol from the sugarcane, they're doing it through paying very exploitative salaries to the workers in the sugarcane plantations.
Hace más de 25 días, miles de trabajadores corteros de caña y sus familias están en paro porque están cansados de que tengan que trabajar más de 12 horas al día, que no les paguen el salario mínimo digno para vivir, que no tengan ningún tipo de garantía social y de seguridad laboral.
Going on 25 days now, over about 10 to 15,000 workers are on strike in the sugarcane fields, and their families are accompanying them on this work stoppage. They're on strike because they're tired of having to work over 12-hour days without receiving even the minimum wage for dignified living. They also don't have social guarantees or job security.
Y ante esos legítimos, ante esos justos reclamos de estos trabajadores y sus familias, la única respuesta que hasta este momento han recibido de parte del gobierno colombiano es que son terroristas y que no van a ser escuchados.
And hearing these very legitimate and just demands of the sugarcane workers, the only response that they have heard from the government has been that the government has called them terrorists.
Son terroristas por reclamar mejores derechos humanos.
They're terrorists for demanding better human rights.
Porque se respeten sus derechos laborales.
That their labor rights be respected.
Porque sueñan con que sus hijos puedan jugar, alimentarse bien, tener salud, ir a la escuela.
Because they dream that their children will be able to play, to be able to eat well, to be able to go to school, to be able to have health care.
Y paralelamente, el Estado colombiano entrega varios millones de dólares en subsidios a los dueños del ingenio porque ellos producen combustibles limpios.
In parallel, we see that the Colombian government is giving over hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to the sugarcane owners because they are producing ethanol.
Por eso, no queremos un tratado de libre comercio que profundizaría mucho más las ventajas para los sectores poderosos y oprimiría mucho más a los sectores débiles y empobrecidos de la sociedad.
And that's why we're against the free trade agreement, because we see that the free trade agreement will just give that many more advantages to the powerful in the society and will oppress even more those who are poor and impoverished and the workers.
Y también porque este sistema de producción ha demostrado que no tiene ningún respeto por la madre naturaleza y que para ganar más va incluso a destruir la diversidad ambiental en cualquier lugar donde la encuentre.
And also because we see that this system of production in no way respects the Mother Earth, and that this system is willing to destroy the Mother Earth for whatever profits it can create.
After such a presentation about something as complex as a free trade agreement, a lot of times you're left with the question, what can I do about this? What can I possibly do about something so complex, so big, and sometimes so seemingly inevitable as the Colombia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement? I've got 4 things for you. That's my job, is to give you things to do. And so I'm going to give them to you. 1, if you're interested in exploring really what this free trade agreement would mean for Colombia, if you're interested in seeing it and having it something that's more than abstract, something that is a daily reality as it is for Colombians, probably about the best way you can do that is to go to Colombia. And we happen to be in the business of going to Colombia. Lina back there, who's faithfully getting a paper I forgot to get, thank you, Lina works out of our Colombia office, which hosts delegations all the time to Colombia. So the idea is that you go and you see very firsthand what's going on in the country. Rather than talking abstractly about a free trade agreement, you go and talk with those sugarcane workers that he was just talking about, that are on strike, that are going on hunger strike. You go to the port of Buenaventura, where they've been working for the last year or so to clear out the port to make way for a port expansion that would come under the free trade agreement, and the way they're making way for it is by killing people. You go and you talk to the farm workers who expect to be losing their livelihoods, possibly moving into another line of production such as coca, if they are pushed out of their jobs by this free trade agreement. You go to talk to these people directly, and that experience stays with you more than any news article ever could. And you come back and you share those experiences with your friends and with your congresspeople. That's the idea of a delegation, and we take them all the time, not just to Colombia, but to Mexico, Nicaragua, and other places as well. If you are interested, talk to Lina and get more details. Doris has been on our delegations. A couple other people here have been on delegations. You can ask them what it's like. This is a calendar of some upcoming delegations that we've got going as well. But since not everyone can go on a delegation, what can you do here? As was mentioned, this free trade agreement is the next thing. It's coming up. It's not going to come up before the election, because that would be political suicide for anyone to bring it up before the election. But it's quite possible that it would come up when our congresspeople, our representatives, are least accountable to us, the lame duck session. That month between the actual elections and the end of the congressional year. It's looking now like there will be a lame duck session, and the biggest risk is that this free trade agreement would come up during this time, because your representatives, quite frankly, don't have to represent you during that time. They don't depend so much on your support, and that's scary. And so this is the time right now when we need to be pressuring them before the elections to let them know exactly how we feel about this free trade agreement. So it is incumbent on everyone, of course, to go ahead and make calls to your congresspeople. But in addition to calling the existing Congress and getting the existing Congress to state their opposition to this free trade agreement, it's at least as important that we try to make sure that the incoming Congress, the Congress of 2009, is the kind of Congress we want to see. The kind of Congress that rejects this failed trade model once and for all. The kind of Congress that will say assuredly no to the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. There's one way I've got of doing that. There's lots of ways of doing that, but there's one I'm suggesting. Bird dogging. Has anyone heard of bird dogging? Lina's been listening to this presentation a couple of times. Hey, I got a couple people back there. All right. You got bird dogging over there? Okay, good. Bird dogging, it's not as extreme or bizarre as it sounds. Bird dogging is simply this. In these next 3 weeks before the elections, all of your candidates are tripping over themselves to try to get your vote. They're having town hall meeting after town hall meeting to try to convince you, the voters, that they are the ones that are best cut out for the job. And it's in these 3 weeks that they are probably most vulnerable, the 3 weeks when they probably are most willing to listen to you, to most do their job, to represent you, because in these 3 weeks that you have something that they want. Unless you're a major donor, the likes of Pfizer or Lockheed Martin, you're probably not going to be competing with them in terms of getting their listening ear in exchange for money, so your vote is really your main power. And this should all be common sense, but sometimes it's not told to us this way. So in these 3 weeks, there is a tactic called bird dogging that you can do to go to these town hall meetings that they're going to have. Simply go to them. There is always a question and answer session, and ask a very pointed question about the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, or about free trade, or whatever free trade aspect most interests you. Ask a question such as one of the ones that we've got here. We've got 3 questions listed. Here's one. You have spoken out, this is to your congressperson, your candidate. You have spoken out for tougher restrictions against illegal immigration. However, you have also voted for CAFTA, a NAFTA-style trade deal expected to exacerbate migration from Central America. Under NAFTA, 2 million Mexican farmers have lost their jobs, and immigration from Mexico has nearly doubled. How do you reconcile your pro-free trade position with your anti-illegal immigration position? Pointed questions, questions that aren't easy to evade, questions that will get a response for two reasons. One is once they respond, you and your fellow community members will know how to vote. Two is if they say something good to you, they say, I'm for change. Everyone, including Sarah Palin these days, is for change, right? So they're probably going to try to tell you, convince you that they're for change. Well, if they're for change, they say, oh yeah, I hate that NAFTA model. You know, I'm not a fan of that. That's bad. Lost a lot of jobs. Then say, that's great. We'll capture that. We'll take that. And a couple months from now, if the Colombia Free Trade Agreement comes up for a vote in Congress, we'll put that back to them. We'll be able to call them up and say, look, this is what you said running up in the run-up to the elections about free trade, about the Colombia Free Trade Deal. Now follow through. So that's what bird-dogging does, and I can't stress enough that it's only a tactic that is relevant for these next 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. So if you are interested, please talk to me afterwards. We can provide a calendar of when people are speaking in your area. There's a lot of people across New York, Gillibrand included, and she's not real near here. I hear your person is actually pretty good right here. But there's a lot of people across New York who really do need a lot of pressure from you. So talk to me afterwards, and we can get other people to go with you, and we can get you a timing of their event, and we've got all the instructions on how to do it on this blue sheet. Next, we're going down the easy train. This is the easier action. Petitions. Everyone likes a petition. This petition tries to pull out an essential point, one that Freddy made, and one that has been made a lot by a number of us, but has not been made often enough by those who represent us in DC. A link between migration and trade. What happened in Mexico? It was mentioned at the beginning. What happened in Mexico under NAFTA? The farmers lost their land. Why did that happen? Right, they couldn't compete with the Olympian athlete, as Freddy was saying. The U.S. agribusiness, when you put Cargill in competition with campesinos, Cargill's going to win. And the number of people who lost were 2 million farming families in Mexico. That's not just 2 million jobs, that's 2 million farm families that had to uproot completely, change their entire livelihood. Where are they now? Many of them have migrated here. And that's what this petition simply tries to pull out. It says, it's to the people who are running for office, it says, if elected, I urge you to take a more comprehensive approach to immigration by rejecting the failed NAFTA model, which leads to impoverishment and thus forces people to leave their homes in search of economic opportunity. We're trying to get 30,000 signatures for this, so that we can present it to those who are running for office at the end of this month in DC. We have 6 regions of witness trees, that's 5,000 a region. So what I'm asking you to do is not just to sign this thing, but take one of these and get your 10 friends or family members or community members or whoever to sign this as well. Once you get 10, you can send it back to me. I live in DC, and I'll be collecting these and taking a huge stack of them along with signatures from all across the country to hand to those who are running for office to represent us in DC.